Texas Lutheran University.
It is my pleasure to introduce Lucas Land, our next speaker for our Krost Symposium. As I was thinking about Lucas speaking this morning, I was remembering our time as students here, and I don't know that I've actually ever told you the story, Lucas, but as a student a few years older than you here at TLU, I thought the whole VeggieTales craze that you started here at TLU was nuts, and it drove me insane as a student. But I've come to see it as a sign of the joy and depth that you bring to life, and your insistence that we not take ourselves too seriously. And I know that I'm guilty of that many times. So it is really good to welcome Lucas here back to chapel, one of our very regular chapel speakers over the years. We were joking that this is almost like a family Hajj. And compared to a previous Krost speaker who talked about where would Jesus frack, I wanted to also note that Lucas actually has a blog, What Would Jesus Eat, to run with that theme. But Lucas is here specifically to talk, the title of his presentation is Watershed, Discipleship, an Ethical and Theological Framework for Ecological Justice. And I did want to say a few things about Lucas. He graduated from TLU in 2001. He is the author of the chapter in our Frex reader about sustainability. He has a music degree here from TLU and a Master of Divinity in Global Missions from George W. Truett Theological Seminary. He lives in Waco and is a very active leader involved with Hope Fellowship and Intentional Christian Community. So please join me in welcoming Lucas.
Thanks, Tim. I really think I should blame Jeff Barkemeyer for the VeggieTales more than anyone. Let's see, am I clicking this yet or no? There we go. Thank you. So as with all good ideas, this one is stolen from someone else. Watershed Discipleship was kind of coined by a guy named Ched Myers. And some of the things that I'm going to say have probably been said maybe in other ways by other speakers. You may have heard them in different ways. But the thing about the global climate crisis is that the solutions are so simple and radical that it takes repeating these things over and over before they begin to sink in and we begin to really understand what we're dealing with. Well, technology. There we go. So, how has our ethics and framework served the whales in this cartoon? So the whale's saying, "It's okay, Hank. I just read that the goal of ethics is to maximize human flourishing." It's working out really well for that whale, right? Okay. So if this is the result of our ethics that elevates human beings above all other creatures, then we need a new framework, right? We need a better framework for understanding and making decisions about human activity in the world. We have a lot of assumptions about how we engage and view creation that go unexamined, and many of them are based on our understanding and our interpretation of the Bible. So we're gonna talk about a few of those. The first one is that we've elevated human beings above all other creatures to the point that we see ourselves as outside of nature. But the scope of ethics and theology has to be all of creation, not just humans. It must include Hank. Okay? We've also allowed capitalism to commodify nature as something that's only good when we can use it, only as a resource. But the creation narrative in Genesis 1 tells us that creation is inherently good, not just because we can use it as human beings, but because God created it. And flourishing is for all creatures. We have focused on human fulfillment and flourishing to the exclusion of other creatures. I put the mosquito up there on purpose to make you a little uncomfortable. That's the creature most people don't really care that it flourishes too much, but flourishing is for all of creation, no exceptions. All right? God in Genesis 1 said this not only to human beings, but also to the birds and the fish. Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas. Let the birds multiply on the earth. So this command that God gives for us to flourish and to fill the earth is not just for human beings, it's for also the birds and the fish. And if that's so, how do we both flourish together? That's the question that really begs. Also, God covenants with all of creation, not just human beings. We tend to read the Bible as if it's really only about God's relationship with human beings. But we have in the flood narrative with Noah, at the end, God saying, I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Okay, so God is covenanting not just with human beings, but with all of creation. Restoration and reconciliation of creation is part of God's vision and mission in the world. It's not just about the forgiveness of our sins and we are reconciled, therefore, to God. God is at work reconciling all of creation to God's self. N.T. Wright considers this passage in Romans 8 the climax of that letter, that Paul is making this argument about what the gospel means. And a little chunk of that part in Romans 8 says, the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So creation is God's target in restoring and reconciling the world, not just human beings. So, what is the human role then, right? If we need to widen the scope of our ethics and our theology to include all of creation, what is our role? What do human beings have to do? What's our purpose? Clickers, maybe? There it goes. Oh, yes. So in Genesis 1, God gives us this passage, let humans have dominion over the fish of the sea, over birds of the air, cattle, wild animals, everything that creeps along the ground. And when we hear this word dominion, what do we hear? We tend to hear the cognates like dominate, right? And our interpretations over the centuries have included that as the idea that our role is to dominate, to subdue. And we have this picture, like this one of God with his feet on the earth, dominating, lording over, right? And that's how we tend to view dominion. But a little later in Genesis 2:15, the command is given to humans to keep and to till, or to cultivate and care for the earth. So really the metaphor that's more appropriate would be a steward, a guardian, or a caretaker. That's the role that God gives to the humans. We also should follow Christ's example, right? So if our role is to be stewards, then we should follow Christ's example as servants. And when we see pictures like this one of the earth suffering under drought, this is a picture from Texas, the cattle suffering under the conditions that they're in, we should be asking, how can I serve the soil? How can I serve this animal, these cattle that are suffering? So these next couple of images were created by an artist who took satellite pictures of a feedlot in Dalhart, Texas, and blew them up and made them into these incredible art pieces. So a lot of Native American traditions have this idea that if you take something from the earth for your survival or for your use, you become responsible for that thing and for the survival of that thing's community, the things on which that species depends. So this is a quote kind of along those lines from Derek Jensen. It says, when you take the life of something to eat, or otherwise use so you can survive, you become responsible for the survival and dignity of that other's community. He says, when I eat beef, I pledge to eradicate factory farming. So our human role is to ensure the continuation, the healing, and the restoration of creation. What if our role as we interacted with creation was regenerative rather than destructive? When we walked in a barren landscape where we were present, there would be flourishing for all creatures. So I really believe this idea of watershed discipleship holds a lot of answers for us as followers of Christ. So what is watershed discipleship? Well, it's an intentional triple entendre. We have three meanings for watershed discipleship. The first is that we are at a watershed moment in history. This is a picture of the recent People's Climate March in Washington, D.C., or was it New York? It was in New York because it was the UN that they were marching with. And we face multiple ecological crises, right? We have climate change, ecological degradation. We're facing a sixth mass extinction, the first mass extinction in history, which is caused by human activity. And so this is a moment in history where the time is running out. Okay, this is a turning point where we are facing a watershed moment. It also means that we need a theology of the watershed. All of us live in a watershed, no matter how ignorant we may be about that fact, which most of us are. A watershed is simply an area of land within which all living things are inextricably linked by their common water source. So how do we create a theology that arises out of an intimate knowledge and relationship with the places where we live? So most of us instantly recognize hundreds of brands of corporations and logos, right? Yet we can only recognize a handful of species of plants that are native to the places where we live. This is the third meaning. We need ecological literacy. We must know the places where we live. We have to be not just disciples in our watersheds, but disciples of our watersheds. This is a quote from Wendell Berry that I think illustrates this point well and also gives us some encouragement as well. The question that must be addressed is not how to care for the planet, but how to care for each of the planet's millions of human and natural neighborhoods, each of its millions of small pieces and parcels of land, each one of which is in some precious way different from all the others. Saving the planet can be very overwhelming, okay? But getting to know our watershed is manageable, and it's necessary for connecting our piece of the puzzle to the global crises that we face. But first, we have to face some difficult truths about what our lives require. What does it require for us to continue to live the way that we have since the Industrial Revolution? Our lives are no longer bioregional. We do not depend on the land beneath our feet. We know this in our heads, but we don't know this in our hearts. We don't know this truth physically the way that people do in communities like this one in Kentucky that deal with mountaintop removal. Those people know this fact physically in a way that we don't. And once that coal is extracted, right, it comes to Texas. This is a coal-fired power plant near Rockdale, Texas. And we burn that so that we can power our cell phones and our computers, so you can write research papers and do all of those things that require that. So bring it home to burn that. This is a graphic from the Minerals Education Coalition. They're an industry group that supports, education about minerals. But I love this graphic because it shows the that it takes 3 million pounds of minerals, metals, and fuels in one lifetime for each American. So I did a little bit of math. There's around 317 million Americans living right now. So that equals 951 million pounds, or 475,500 tons of minerals, metals, and fuels for each person that's alive today. Now, I have 3 kids, okay, so I just contributed 9 million more pounds to this picture. So don't think that I'm somehow above reproach or separate from the system. We're all embedded in this system. Most people have a cell phone, so if you have a cell phone, if you wouldn't mind just taking it out and holding it up. All right? So we're all in the same boat together, right? This technology requires minerals that are mined all over the world. Gold, tungsten, bauxite, all kinds of minerals. And those minerals tend to be the sources of conflict in the countries where they are mined. And we need to remember that it's our lifestyles, it's our wants, not our needs, that require these minerals. Daniel Quinn, who wrote the book Ishmael, puts it this way: we're captives of a civilizational system that more or less compels us to go on destroying the world in order to live. So how is it possible that we can continue such destructive lifestyles without feeling or noticing the consequences? As I said earlier in the chapel talk, there we go, we outsource this destruction to other places. And part of what makes that possible is racism, ethnocentrism. We care a lot less about people on other sides of the world, and we don't think about it in our daily lives. So that's what makes it possible for us to outsource the destructiveness that our lives require. This requires this. Therefore, environmental justice requires a new economics. We may not be able to simply extract ourselves from this economy and pretend like we can live on an alternate plane of reality, but what we can do is be honest about what our lives, what civilization and society requires. And I really believe that's the only way that we are going to move forward. And I also believe that without making it personal, we're never going to make headway. It has to matter to us personally in our individual lives. This is a quote from Leonardo Boff, who's a Brazilian liberation theologian. He says, "What we need is to be stirred and have a deep experience. Only a personal relationship with the earth will make us love it." So I want to tell you a little story about myself and why this issue is personal to me. That's me with my daughter Lydia when we were living in Bolivia. We moved to World Hunger Relief to learn about sustainable agriculture and international development work, and after learning skills there, we moved to Bolivia and worked with Mennonite Central Committee in a rural city on agriculture and water issues. And so I learned a lot, both from living at the farm and living in Bolivia, about living a lot closer to the earth. Our house in Bolivia had 3 rooms. They all opened to the outside. The bathroom was a separate building, and we lived very close to the earth. I had a garden, a demonstration plot, and grew some of what we ate. At the farm and in Bolivia, we used composting toilets, so we weren't using water to flush our toilets. We were composting and reusing that as a resource. And along the way as well, I thought and read a lot about this idea of collapse, that an economy based on finite resources that believes in infinite growth eventually will reach a point where it's just not going to work anymore, right? And so I was reading about a lot of these things. I was reading Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, And a lot of these things were kind of in my mind a lot at the time. And in Bolivia, we didn't have any central heating or central air. During the winter, our kids slept in the same room with us to sort of conserve body heat and that sort of thing. We had a couple little space heaters that kind of took the edge off of the cold. So one night, I was putting my kids to bed, and occasionally, water would not be available for an afternoon. At the most, it was 4 days that we didn't have water. Electricity sometimes would go out. And so I was putting my kids to bed and getting them ready, getting them all in bed, and then I had the heaters on, I had the light on, and then all of a sudden, the lights went off, the heaters went out, and I looked out, and all the lights were out in the street, and my first thought was, oh my God, this is it. I'd been reading, it's a little silly now that I look back on it, but I was reading so much about collapse, I thought, oh my God, the grid has gone out, there's no more electricity, the world is, it's this post-apocalyptic kind of movie, which I can laugh about now. But what happened, though, is that I began to have an imagination for what life would be like without the things that we assume are going to be there every day. I remember sitting in our yard in Bolivia and looking up at the stars, so far from any light pollution. It's more stars than I've ever seen in my life, and thinking, human beings have lived on this planet for thousands of years without all of the things that I assume I have to have in order to survive. So we need an imagination for what life can be like on this planet. So what would a sustainable economy and a sustainable lifestyle look like? We need resources for tackling this problem. We need practices for redeeming and reconciling the human and the non-human. One of our first resources as Christians is Scripture. The Bible was written by people like this woman. And we don't read the Bible with those same eyes, okay? This is what modern human beings look like, all right? How does this person read a book 2,000 years old written by this woman? We need to be reading the Bible with new eyes. We need to read the Bible with an ecological lens. I highly recommend Ellen Davis's book, Scripture, Culture, and Agriculture, an agrarian reading of the Bible, which goes a long way to help us get there. When we read the Bible without that ecological lens, this is what we're doing. When we are disconnected from nature and we read the Bible, this is what happens. As I mentioned already, another resource that we need for a new creation is ecological literacy. This is where I'm from. This is my watershed. I live in Waco, Texas. We're part of the Brazos River Basin. We are one of the most studied watersheds in America. A long time ago, they started noticing algae blooms in Lake Waco, and all of the phosphorus runoff from dairy farms north of where I live was causing algae blooms in Lake Waco, and so they began to study that a lot, extensively. So the Bosque River that ends up in Lake Waco has been studied pretty extensively. I love maps. I really like maps. So we need to know our places. This is a map of the ecoregions of Texas. Waco is in the Blackland Prairie, but it's in a weird place of the Blackland Prairie where it's kind of bordered on both sides by different ecoregions. So most of you are probably from one of these ecoregions in Texas. Your ecoregion has certain characteristics, certain plants and animals that do well there, and we need to understand the places that we live. What is the soil like? What are the native plants and animals? What flourished in your area prior to colonization? How did people without all the trappings that we have live in the places where we live? If you don't know your place, you won't pay attention to how changes in the environment affect it. There's a quote from a Senegalese environmentalist, Baba Dioum, who says, "We won't save places we don't love. We won't love places that we don't know, and we won't know places that we haven't learned." And all of us, myself included, have a lot of learning to do. So the next resource comes to us from social work and community organizing. There's a method of assessing communities called asset-based community development that looks at the strengths of communities and maps them in certain ways. I said I love maps, so I'm continuing the mapping theme. What if we use some of those techniques to look at the themes of sustainability and transitioning to fossil fuel-free economies in our communities, in our cities, in our neighborhoods? This is a map in Toronto that mapped some of the resources in their area. I've been working on a project in Waco creating an urban foraging map. There are lots of fruit trees that are in public places or hanging over sidewalks where it's freely available. I recently discovered a gold mine of about 3 fig trees on McLennan Community College campus that are loaded with figs, and they just go to waste every year. So there's also websites like fallingfruit.org. There's a couple of other websites where you can map your communities for what is freely available. But then we need to ask ourselves, what communities are we mapping? Are we mapping the suburbs or the inner city or other communities of migrant farm workers? Another resource for us in learning how to move forward with these crises is downward mobility. Living with communities that are more affected by ecological problems will teach us how to deal with the crises we face. This is a quote from Ched Myers. "What is enough for us in our time? One of the best ways for us to investigate that is to be in relationship with people who have less than we do. I think Scripture actually invites us to get our perspective by having real relationships with people who are, in fact, more marginalized, less socially mobile, less fiscally well-off than we are, because it's from those folks that we can probably best get our bearings about what constitutes enough." Now, it's not a question of whether or not our economy will transition to being fossil fuel free. It's a question of when. It's a finite resource. We cannot continue indefinitely, and that's something that needs to sink in. We want to look for a fossil-free fuel economy. Working on that now is better because it's an inevitability. Natural gas, hydraulic fracturing, deep water exploration, other new technologies and techniques to extract energy from the ground are only ways of avoiding the inevitable. There are movements at institutions and organizations like this one, like Texas Lutheran, to divest in different ways from finances that support the fossil fuel economy and extractive industries. What about Texas Lutheran? These movements are led by students primarily, so get busy. The sooner that our institutions start divesting from fossil fuels and extractive industries, the sooner we can all get to a life and an economy beyond those resources. Tackling this problem requires radical changes in our politics and our economics. Another resource as we think about our places, creating bio-regional economies and ecologies, is asking ourselves the question, what can my watershed provide? So not only what can my watershed provide, but also how can I adapt my wants to what my watershed can provide? This is a quote from Todd Winward, who wrote an article called Region as Rabbi. "Even as I adapt, however, a part of me wants to remain an unconscious and self-absorbed consumer." Do you feel it too? I do. That's not his quote. I do. "We both know it's easier to remain a spoiled child instead of mature into a responsible adult. Yet, in this watershed moment of history, with humanity's existence in the balance, it's clear our watersheds call us to do something old school, to repent and turn around. To what extent can we thrive within the bounty and the boundaries of our bioregions? We'll only know when we start trying. So how can we produce more of what we consume? How can we think about the spaces around us differently? This photo is from a book by Adrian Chessers called The Return. He followed these modern-day hunter-gatherers through the American West as they forsook the total, society. They wander like nomads. They hunt. They forage for their food. They live off the waste that society produces. And as I think about these people and their complete rejection of the society that we've created, I realize that the future is going to require of us a renewed intimacy and relationship with the land and with the animals. We have to ask what is necessary for life and what is necessary for flourishing and what is not. We have to change our definition of the good life. When I lived at World Hunger Relief, I was introduced to a skill that some people such as this have found very valuable called dumpster diving. And it's incredible the amount of food that's wasted in this country. It's 40% of all food that's produced. That's a ridiculous number. And I've seen some of that food myself firsthand. I've eaten some of that food myself that a grocery store throws away. Perfectly good, edible food lying in a dumpster, going to a landfill. How can we live more off of the waste that we're producing? The new creation is going to require us to get our hands dirty. I know that's probably not a happy thought for some of you. The other resource that we have is the sharing economy. This is a term that's becoming a lot more popular to kind of encompass economic relationships that sort of fall outside of the free market capitalist system. Ched Myers talks about this in terms of Sabbath economics. Others call it Jubilee economics. But economic relationships that embrace the vision of shalom that we find in the Bible. So a few examples of this. In my community, we started a time bank where people, instead of using money to exchange value, they use their time. So if I come to your house and paint your fence, the amount of time that I spent painting your fence gets banked, and then I can use that to ask for help from someone else to come help me do something that I need help with. So banking your time, finding ways to share. We also have about 5 little free libraries in my neighborhood where if you've seen these little boxes in front of people's houses, people can put their old books in there. You can take a book anytime. You can return it. You can get rid of your old books. It's a way of sharing rather than spending all your money on Amazon, which is what I tend to do. I'm a sucker for a good book, so finding ways to share. And then the beauty of that is you also find the spontaneity of those interactions and relationships, somebody's book you never have heard of that you find. Other examples, tool libraries, both at municipal libraries that are loaning out tools, and also tool sharing groups. I share a lawnmower and a weed eater with several of my neighbors. We don't all need to own all of these tools, okay? We can share the minimum or borrow, when we need it. Car sharing is another example, all the way from Zipcar, Lyft, Uber, these companies, large companies that are trying to cash in on this idea of not owning a car but using a car when you need it, to people in my community who are sharing cars between families and between different people in the community. So these are just a few examples of things that we can practice now. One last thing that I want to mention is the Transition Town movement. This started in the United Kingdom. a guy named Rob Hopkins and a bunch of other people started thinking, how do we get our town to transition from this industrialized system that's based on fossil fuels to a community and a city that's based on something a lot more sustainable. We are in this period of transition, whether we like it or not. We can create communities and cities that are going to make this transition, or some that won't, and anywhere in between on the spectrum, right? So the thing is that I really want to emphasize this. We can start living out these alternatives right now. You do not have to wait for the UN to get its act together to start living out alternative economics in your communities. We're doing it piece by piece in my community. We all held up our cell phones, okay? We're all in the boat together. I'm not perfect in my community, but we're beginning to try to say, what does it look like when we begin to practice these things, and practicing them now? Throughout history, this is how changes happen. When people begin to live as if the future that we want is reality, it begins to shake the foundations of the things that we rely on. So I want to end with this quote from a guy named Rusty Pritchard that I think sums it up well. Our real need is for the moral courage to face a very different future and the holy imagination to rethink what makes a flourishing society, to dare to imagine a prosperous way down. Thank you.
So at this point, we have a few minutes for questions and dialogue. I ask that we be respectful in our dialogue with one another, and also that if you do come forward, that you either ask a question or you make a short comment that Lucas can respond to. So we'll take a few minutes to do that and invite you forward.
Hi, my name is Sam Brannon. I live in Austin, Texas, and I work for the Texas Interfaith Center for Public Policy, and the Krost Symposium is just wonderful. Thank you for coming. I'm leading up so this is more of a comment. I'm leading up a program called Water Captains, getting lay people involved in public water planning. And so knowing your water basin and being a disciple of water is very, very important. And so I'd like to learn more about what it means when you say being a disciple of water. If you could focus a little more on that.
Sure. As I said, ecological literacy is where most of us are at. We don't really know our watersheds. I remember a couple years ago, my family taking a vacation to Freeport. There's some nice beaches in Freeport that's also the home of Dow and pretty large chemical plants. But that's where my watershed empties out into the Gulf, and I had no idea, how little we know about our watershed. So for me, that's the starting point. We're starting a group in Waco called Sustainable Waco, and mainly we just get together and talk and try to think about what are some policies that we can advocate for in our community. But one of the people that showed up to our meeting was our local watershed administrator. And I was like, whoa, we have one of those? I had no idea. So getting to know people in your community that know a lot more than you about where you live. Part of her job is visiting with all of those dairy farms north of us to make sure that they're following the regulations to prevent phosphorus runoff that causes algae blooms. So yeah, for me, that's just the starting point. Getting to know where we live. We're so far removed that there's just so much work to do in that. But it's also a great place to start.
Now, I just wanted to make a quick comment, Lucas, that John Wesley Powell and then later on Eugene Odom, that wrote the first widely used text on ecology, they strongly propose that watersheds be social, political, economic, ecological units for management. And then H.T. Odom Eugene's brother, wrote this book, Prosperous Way Down. Not a very well-written book, but, it's still good to read,
Yeah.
I think. Just before he died, he wrote that little book, Prosperous Way Down.
Yeah. A lot of these ideas have been around for a long time. E.F. Schumacher, was an economist in the 70s who wrote a little book called Small is Beautiful. He was still an industrialist, but a lot of his ideas were doing the math about what connecting resources, actual natural physical resources to the economy, and showing that our economy is based on those. There's no way to separate our economics from our ecology. So yeah, a lot of others have been thinking these same things, writing more or less well over the years, but these ideas have been around a long time.
Thank you. I appreciate the paradigm that you've laid out, which I think is beautiful. And I guess my question has to do with how do we negotiate the powers that be, for lack of better words, that work against that? Because, you mentioned politics, you mentioned changing the economic system. You sort of glided over that in order to show us a really beautiful picture, and I think that's important. But I also think if you're going to be talking about, what it is to live with people that are a little more disenfranchised than we might be on a college campus, you also got to take the fact that means daily damage control, and it means fighting the systems. And just to go back to the Watershed, I'm going to miss tonight in San Antonio a meeting where a lot of community people are trying to get our water district not to start buying water from Vista Ridge from up in the Northeast for the various obvious reasons. But it doesn't look like our current mayor is for that, and it looks like it's going to go through. We're stuck in this situation where we've got failing infrastructure. On my street, 3 houses in 3 months have had in front of them the main water has broken. It's broken all over. We've got water problems from the fracking and from the drought and whatever, and they're buying new water in order to sell it based on the customers using rate change from the customers, a rate increase. So how do you deal with all those issues? Can you give us, not the specifics, but I just used the water.
Right. Well, I think the first thing that, and I emphasize living this out now, not waiting for the powers that be to get it all squared away, because we all know how hard that is and how difficult and frustrating that can be. With that, to not do it alone. So many of us feel we still have this idea that we are individual consumers and that we bear all of the responsibility of changing our personal lives to be completely sustainable. Well, that's why I wanted everybody to hold up your cell phone. It's not going to happen, okay? We're embedded in this culture, in this society. We know that it's sick. We know that it has problems. I mentioned in my chapel talk that in order to untangle allegiances that we have to ways of being and ways of living, our communities and our society has shaped those for us to this point. It's going to take other communities to untangle those allegiances for us. So I'm part of an intentional Christian community in Waco where we do a lot of hard work. Some of it's very personal, spiritual disciplines work that's connected. Thomas Merton and a lot of others have really taught us that those spiritual practices in our faith communities are part of untangling those things for us. But we have to do them in connection with others. We can't do them alone. The other thing I want to say is that it's hard because we're really pulled between this tension between global systems and, even in this conference, I feel that tension, right? That we want to give ourselves local things that we can do to make a difference in the world. What can we do in Texas? What are the issues right here before us? But at the same time, when we hold up our cell phones, we recognize nothing that we do here in Texas is separate from the global economy that we've constructed together. And let's just say that we've done this together and confess that as a human community, right? So we have to live in that tension. We need Bill McKibben and people working in the grassroots on large scales to stop things like fracking and the Keystone XL. But as long as our personal lives continue to demand those resources, once we stop the Keystone, there's just still demand for those energy resources. And so we have to act with both of those things in mind. But I really do believe that knowing our own watershed, and especially as we start to figure out how our watershed fits into the rest of the global economic picture, it helps us feel more like that matters to the global piece, even though we may only be acting locally. I'm not sure if that helps. It's just the kind of the reality we do live in, but you're right.
Winona LaDuke spoke here about 3 weeks ago over at Jackson Auditorium, and she realizes there's no distinction now between global and local and regional. Global climate change will swamp everything locally. I was with her and other First Nations people and Naomi Klein and Bill McKibben at a First Nations healing walk in northern Alberta about 15 months ago. And all of those people realized that too. Prosperous way down. I think the Northern Europeans, the Scandinavians, Germany, the Netherlands have shown a way how we can do that. Mm-hmm. For example, air conditioning. The set point in public buildings in the United States is 70 to 72 degrees. In Northern Europe, it's 76 to 78. Air conditioning swamps the energy that are used by cell phones and computers. It's the elephant in the room. They're the mice. Germany, for example, has 3 to 4 times the percentage of its workforce in manufacturing, yet it has a carbon footprint 1/2 of ours per capita. Mm-hmm. It has 20 times the solar energy per capita, or 20 times per capita as much solar energy as we do, 5 times as much totally, and so on. The California drought, the worst drought on record in California. You said either statement. Okay. Yeah. Well, okay, I'm done.
Well, thanks for Roland for bringing up air conditioning. I had a couple of things that happened to me this week that reminded me kind of what you're saying. Our air conditioning at our house went out, and I mentioned that in Bolivia we lived without air conditioning, and oftentimes, in the hot months it's just hot, and it's hot all the time. It's 90, 95. And you learn ways to cope, ways to deal with that. You live a lot of life outside and that sort of thing, and realizing that that's possible. We've been back from Bolivia for about 3 years now, so we've gotten used to having some of those things that we didn't have before. And what I find interesting is whenever something happens like that, our AC went out, and luckily it's fall in Texas. It's not too bad, right? But whenever that happens, I start to think, I am so dependent on this thing, and I don't think about it necessarily every day, but when it's gone, I think, how would I survive without it? And actually, on the way driving here, we had a flat tire in the middle of rush hour traffic in Austin, and a nice couple stopped and helped us out. We walked to a gas station to air up my flat spare, unfortunately, but it made me start to think about all of the things involved in keeping me going on the road and all of those other cars on the road, not just fuel, but the maintenance required, the tires, and all of that sort of stuff. And it's good in those moments, I think, like Roland is saying, to stop to think about the things that we depend on, the things that our daily lives require, and ways that we can change it. Changing the thermostat's, a great example. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing what you adjust to, when you have to.
So we have come to 11:20, which was the end of our time. I want to offer Lucas a final 30 seconds to send us home with whatever, or away with whatever final thoughts. And so here's your final chance.
All right. Well, I really wanted to offer you a mix of, some resources and ideas, but reality check, really thinking about what we're facing in ways that are not just surface level, but realizing this is a crisis that goes to the very heart of what our society has built. But hopefully giving you resources for hope, both biblical resources for hope, but also amongst our communities and things that people are doing, that it doesn't have to mean the end of the world. It doesn't have to be the zombie apocalypse that we end up living in. We can find a prosperous way down. So, thank you.
For more information, please visit tlu.edu.